Helvetii is an action-packed roguelite that doesn't mess around. It can be extremely unforgiving, but at the same time highly entertaining. Regardless of whether you're used to games with a steep degree of difficulty, this is a game that can challenge most people in a fun way. But for me, it started off pretty bad. I learned my basic abilities and then went into battle. I fought harmless enemies and also managed to take down the first boss. And in my mind I thought, hey, this is not so bad. Everything is going as planned. But when I approached the game's second boss, I understood that it wouldn't be an easy journey. Pretty quickly I was eliminated and I stood there wondering, what did I do wrong and what could I have done differently? And that's exactly how this game is designed. It's about learning the enemy's patterns and abilities and how I can counter in a well-balanced way. Trying to blindly advance without paying attention to your opponent can be fatal, but at the same time this is what makes the game an excellent choice for all those who have a penchant for challenging 2D games. It's harsh, but fair. Helvetii is also a fairly short game, but it's packed with content. Should you succeed in mastering the challenges that await, you can still look forward to a variety that makes the game more extensive than you might think. I realized pretty quickly that each level has a randomized design, something that is common in roguelites, but as I slowly made my way forward, it became clear what it takes to survive. Namely, to upgrade the hero and raise its stats. The 4 attributes we're talking about are strength, agility, dexterity and luck. And this is one of 2 ways to strengthen a character, by buying stats. The difficulty lies in the fact that you only have 1 life. If your health pool runs out, it's game over, so it's about making the character as strong as possible and finding items that can extend the adventure. Most courses in the game have a shop and these can play a crucial role. The shopkeeper, who happens to be an owl, sells items that boost any of the 4 attributes. And this is one of 2 ways to strengthen a character, by buying stats. You cannot find upgrades by fighting enemies. You either go to the owl and buy stuff, or buy sigils between levels. But more on that later. As a side note, I also want to point out that there is no gear or weapons in the game. The only thing that can be upgraded is your stats. You can certainly find chests with items that give you a boost, but this is like a lottery because some treasures raise one ability at the expense of something else. The same principle applies when you find special gods. They can give you new abilities and are a good help, especially on boss fights, but at the expense of your health. But then I discovered a new problem. I needed money, and lots of it. Most of the time the upgrades are relatively expensive and money can be hard to come by. But sometimes I was lucky and managed to find capital in treasure chests or when I looted some random enemy. That way I could make my character stronger. As I learned to engage the enemy properly, I noticed a change, namely that I developed my knowledge of the game's basic functions, especially in terms of dealing with all enemies. Sometimes you fight enemies at ground level, sometimes in the air. All enemies have different numbers of abilities that may prove necessary to learn. In the beginning I found it difficult to fight the blue birds. This was due to their ability to launch blue projectiles. They proved to be tricky to avoid depending on one's own hitbox. It's not possible to crouch, so sometimes you can feel that you're limited depending on your own mobility, but I found effective ways to deal with my opponents. The combination of dashing sideways and interrupting the enemy's attacks by constantly charging proved to be a very good strategy, and it turned out to be a method that was applied more and more often. No matter what attacks the enemies used, I saw myself surviving the most critical situations. But the further into the game you get, the tougher it gets. Particularly difficult are the airborne monsters that can be difficult to hit depending on the height. They also shoot razor-sharp projectiles that do a lot of damage, but at the same time it's the variety of challenges that makes this an entertaining adventure. Relaxing can prove to lead to certain death, but if you keep your concentration up, the outcome can be positive. So why is this a comprehensive game? On the surface it might seem like a fairly short game. It only contains 4 courses that are divided into 2 parts. That is, each course contains 2 acts with a boss at the end. But there is actually more to do than you might think. First, in true roguelite spirit, there is an upgrade system that persists through death. If you complete a course, you get a certain number of crystals, which are distributed depending on how well you performed. These crystals can then be used to buy more health for other things that can strengthen one's character, but you need to play through the game several times if you want to upgrade everything to 100%. This means the replay value is high. It's actually a smart way to design a game, by always having something to strive for. You keep going. In terms of characters, there are 3 to choose from: a warrior, a beast and a druid. They have unique skills and play completely differently. A warrior can be considered a standardized character that I feel is relatively predictable. There isn't really much that stands out, but nothing that feels strange either. You have a normal sword attack, a special attack that can break shields, he throws axes, and control-wise he is well balanced without feeling overly mobile or clumsy. He is the definition of a normalized warrior who relies on high strength. The beast, however, is the complete opposite. His attacks are significantly faster but also weaker. Instead of breaking shields, the beast relies on parrying attacks, something that I thought felt quite challenging to master. This is because the enemy is still given the opportunity to attack, and I'd rather see them disarmed than have the chance to do harm. The third character is perhaps the one that stands out the most. This is a mana-using mage that is very effective with ranged attacks. Although the magician has a relatively limited health pool, it is compensated by being able to stay away from the enemy. I've found that the ranged attacks can be very smooth to use, especially against enemies that are dangerous in melee. The overall impression of the three heroes is that they are very different, and depending on what you prefer, most people can find their favorite. Let's discuss performance. In games of this type, a stable frame rate is important because you have to make quick decisions, use quick reflexes, and be ahead of the enemy in thought. And overall, this is a very solid game. My perception was that I was never affected by crashes, bugs or low frame rate. But just to confirm my experience, I ran some FPS tests, and very true, this is a game with a solid performance. Whether I was fighting tons of enemies, fighting a boss, or just running around through the levels, everything flowed very smoothly. In my opinion, the developers have set a standard for how games of this type should be experienced. That is, an experience free from external distractions. This is a solid game. When it comes to the control, you should be aware that we are talking about three completely different ways of playing, but in common is that the control is very easy to use. Since this is a game that sometimes requires quick decisions, it goes along with a responsive control. The only thing that bothers me is that the characters in certain situations feel oversized. You have a fairly large hitbox, but because the control is easy to handle, it's mostly easy to get out of sticky situations. In addition, there is the possibility to customize the control in the menu, but the basic settings themselves are very logical. You jump with B, swing with Y, and shoot projectiles with A. It's predictable. Helvetii is an action-packed game that can appeal to those who enjoy simple character development combined with a fast-paced gameplay. It's a game with a high replay value, also due to the fact that new bosses can be unlocked. In addition, the difficulty level can be set in the menu, but it's not the classic easy, medium or hard. Instead, you decide how much damage the enemy will do. It goes from 50% up to 200%. But even though the game has a relatively superficial narrative about good and evil, this becomes an experience that is primarily about the gameplay. I can recommend this game, not necessarily for the story, but rather if you prefer smooth two-dimensional action. Feel free to subscribe to my channel. I review new games every week. Have a nice day. See ya!